Good afternoon and welcome back to the NGV Triennial Conversations, a program here at the Great Hall of NGV International in Melbourne, where we are going to have a panel called Get Real Estate. And joining me today on our panel will be Michael Bleeby, Jill Garner and Amy Muir. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today here on the lands of the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and through them to all Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous peoples. And of course, we would also like to acknowledge that people joining us on the live stream today or watching afterwards online, of course, will be joining us from other traditional lands, and we would like to acknowledge the custodians of those places. The panel today are gathered to look at the interesting, sort of speculative world of real estate development, and it's inspired by a project here in the Triennial that has been designed by a team from Switzerland and Finland, BTVV. Most widely known for their 2018 project House Tour, which was the 2018 winner of the Golden Lion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. They've developed a new project for the NGV Triennial called Walls for Sale, supersized, and this project is on the ground floor of NGV International and opens today. And we're going to have a quick look at some footage of that project to sort of set the scene for our conversation. Now, so as we glide silently through Walls for Sale BTVV's scheme, what this team are doing with this work of satirical, critical architecture is drawing attention to the sort of white-on-white interiors or the ubiquitous banality of low-quality real estate development. They're also drawing our attention to the kitchen bench top, the appliance, the toilet fitting or the sink that are used as the key features to sell real estate to us today, and the way that the imagery of real estate is manipulated in the marketplace for real estate in Australia. So today's panel, we have Michael Bleeby, who's a senior journalist at the Australian Financial Review, writes extensively on property, Jill Garner, the Victorian government architect, and Amy Muir, multi-award-winning architect and someone who's been very involved in the Victorian architecture industry. Michael, I wanted to start with you. You had an opportunity to walk through BTV's scheme. Now, you spend your life, I imagine, your working life, thinking about real estate, writing about property. And it's a complicated world. It's very much part of Australian culture, real estate and identity. When you walked into their scheme, I'm just interested in what it's quite a funny space, but what did it make you think about, and what was the sort of, what came to you from that project?
It made me want to laugh and cry in equal measure, I suppose. I think if you go through so many display suites in the course of my work, looking at these promises that are being sold, and these promises that people are being encouraged to commit themselves to with debts that will last them for many decades. And I thought it was poignantly accurate. I'm aware of at least one buyer of an off-the-plan apartment here in Melbourne who has seriously considered suing the developer that they contracted to buy from over misleading imagery that made them think they were buying a larger apartment than what they ended up with. So yes, this is perhaps exaggerating that, but it's pointing to a very real issue. I wonder if one of the conditions that has allowed this situation to occur is the fact that there seems to be very little in the way of requirements or, I guess, governance around truth in advertising in real estate sales. What consumer protections are there to ensure that, it does what it says on the box?
Indeed. Well, it's a really good question. That's what they're drawing attention to, is that, if we think about, these are architects talking about real estate. Whether they're actually talking about architecture is another matter. But if we stick with real estate for the moment, Amy, when you went into the display suite for the residences at NGV International, this hypothetical development that they've designed, as an architect, what does it make you feel?
Well, I think, this idea of the interior being, as Michael's saying, like, how do we understand architecture? And is it only through the interior when we talk about, the display suite? How do we understand where we're living? Like, what is that as a building that we're actually occupying as a sort of cultural intent as well? And I think that this highlights very clearly that the way that the space articulates itself, as you're highlighting, is that we're assessing that architecture based on object and based on how would we occupy this space through objects in space, rather than sort of understanding how we would sit within a city and how we would occupy that place, as a way of living. And I think, this sort of idea of investment and property development has sort of really forgotten about what we're doing, which is designing places for people to occupy, to live. And so where does that then sit within the city and how the city sort of develops itself? But I think, things like when we see the giant AC unit sitting on the balcony, knowing that when we're on the outside of that building, that becomes one of the most dominant features on the facade. And they become the leftovers, the things that aren't coordinated into the design. It's the cheapness of not being able to have that integrated into the building, and it becomes an add-on. And that add-on then becomes an architectural element to the building.
Now, you talk about the idea that we're building homes, but Jill, I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, if we're thinking about, this is speculative real estate we're talking about, a lot of buildings have gone up in Melbourne and in Brisbane and in Sydney and in cities all over the world. But of course, we have to remember that this idea for this project originated in Switzerland, where the architects were talking about a condition there. It's the same thing. And we have Pencil Towers on Central Park in New York. And so this swirling world of speculative real estate, which is really about money and investment. So as a person who is a government representative to look at quality in the built environment, it's your your day job. Um, are these homes or are these investment? Are these like bonds or stocks? Are these just investment things, products?
I suspect they are their investments. They're kind of money in the bank in some ways. But they are a roof over someone's head, and that's really important. I think what is intriguing about the exhibition, which I agree, it's very funny. It's not funny until you go into it, because I think what's interesting is the imagery that you see is scaleless. And I think that's what is interesting about photography, is there is no scale attached to it. So you have no perception that room is bigger than you or smaller than you. And it really highlights to me that idea of people buying off the plan, those that can't read space can't read dimensional accuracy, and who trust the developer to give them something that will feel kind of light and airy and have good views and have some good pieces of equipment in it. Maybe that's a distraction. But in reality, most people, I mean, Michael talked about one person who was going to sue a developer. I've heard of hundreds who are so outraged when they take possession of their apartment and they find that the windows that they thought were windows are actually frosted and they can't see out. So all of the impression they had of what they were buying is inaccurate. And I think that's why it's funny, but it's also quite poignant, really.
It's dark humour. Let's be serious.
But they are
probably
still
because of a lack of natural light. But on that idea of impression, Michael, the artist's impression, so that it's quite normal. I think everybody who's watching will have experienced looking at a real estate ad on our website, that there are many of them, and they're obviously very lucrative. This idea of the render or the art of the artificial drawing of something that isn't even built, and they all look like spa resorts, and they've all got this sort of certain, beauty about them. But how do you feel about that? I mean, as a journalist who's looking at real estate, how do you feel about the artist's impression, and what do you think are the sort of top 5 things that a developer uses or a real estate agent uses to try and hook the potential buyer in that environment that they've created, that virtual view?
It's emotion, isn't it? I mean, this is the biggest amount of money that most people are likely to spend in their lives. And we're being encouraged to make it by the way it makes us feel. Whereas, if we think about other aspects of our financial lives, we go to a financial advisor and we don't expect to feel anything when we talk to a financial advisor other than boredom. Because it's something we approach in a rational, methodical, what's my projected return? What will this mean, when I'm 65? That sort of thinking that you would take to a normal, sort of a non-property investment seems to sort of go out the window so often when you look at these beautiful pictures that are making you feel something.
So do you think there is, but is this like the seduction that you're talking about? Do you think, like Amy, for example, do you think there's a trick implicit in that? Because if BTVV's scheme is accurate, what they're saying is that it's walls for sale. The architecture is potentially irrelevant. It's a space, and the things that matter are, does it have air conditioning? Does it have a bench top made of a certain material? Does it have a cooker that's a certain brand? What does that say about architecture today in terms of, does that mean that architecture is being eroded to a point where the determinants of value are these simple sets of items?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 things there. One is, as Jill's sort of saying, the quality of space and being able to read a plan and interpret space is not necessarily something that everyone understands until they experience the space. And so a lot of, this idea of how the value of architecture primarily is through how we feel in a space and how we manoeuvre through it, how we occupy it, and the quality of those spaces is something that we actually feel. It's a felt thing. So if we're buying off a plan and we're investing, potentially investing, which then is, something that someone might even need to occupy through renting, how valuable does that space actually become if it's not something that resonates with those who actually occupy it? And so I think that there's this, once again, in terms of talking about it through objects and, and the cooktop being the thing that is going to allow us to feel good in that space because it brings a certain level of quality, it's completely undermining the value that architecture brings to people's lives and the way that they would benefit from life if they lived in a
So
in a
are
space
you making a claim that architecture is far more than specifying a cooker and a bench top?
Oh, maybe. Possibly. I don't know.
You would like to think so.
But indeed,
Maybe.
this raises an important question, Jill. So if architecture is far more than that, why? How does it? What are the forces that you see at play that would bring someone who's developing one of these buildings to see architecture potentially as a cost to be avoided? What is that? Would that be a fair observation?
A cost to be avoided. Yeah, I'm reminded when the apartment boom started in Melbourne and the Government Architect's Office kind of got a bit concerned about the quality of some of the apartments that were being watched roll out. One of my colleagues pointed out this amazing app that exists in London, which is called Swing a Cat. And when you go to either buy an apartment or rent, maybe it's a rental app, when you go to rent an apartment, it takes you through this series of questions and it says, do you have a bike? Is there somewhere for you to put your bike? Do you have a vacuum cleaner? Is there somewhere for you to put that? Do you have, how much clothes storage do you need? Sporting goods, those sorts of things. Do you have a queen size bed? Can it fit in this? So it's a very user-friendly kind of buyer beware app that allows the person who's going to effectively lease or rent that space to make sure that they ask themselves the right questions. So instead of seeing a very nice toilet suite, which is an incredible distraction, they look at the bedroom and wonder if their queen-size bed will fit in that space or whether they will be able to fit their sporting goods in the space. Because what we see in Melbourne is that the balcony, apart from holding the air conditioning unit, it also becomes people's storeroom or their bicycle storage or their sporting goods storage. So, you look at a lot of balconies and they're full of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, but if we accept that there are ways for the consumer to interrogate this, obviously something's going on when we have so many of these products being sold. The business model must work somehow. What for you, Michael, writing about this, analysing this, what is the dominant business model? It's not necessarily people designing homes for people to live in. This is an investment. So who's going to live in these, and who's generally investing in them, do you think?
I think if we're thinking about the most recent apartment boom in central Melbourne, which is sort of now coming to an end, there's certainly very few new projects being built. A lot of it would have been, I guess, projects funded by a lot of offshore capital. We're all aware of the large wave of capital that was coming in, both from developers from China who were looking to expand, developers from Malaysia, developers from emerging Asia, where there is a rising level of middle-class wealth of the likes at which those countries have never seen before. And people are justifiably seeking ways to safeguard and preserve that. Now, one of those ways is by developing real estate in safe established markets such as Australia. So we had massive capital coming in to develop this. And also, I guess, a wave of buyers, of people who were far more used and accustomed to living in apartments than, much of middle-class Australia has been. Yes, Sydney has probably led the way in terms of apartment living in East Coast Australia. Melbourne, being much sort of flatter and spread out, has post-war been far more a city of of suburban living. All of a sudden there was this financial change, this level of investment, but also waves of people who were comfortable with and looking for, and people who understood living in apartments.
I mean, this is an interesting point because, and Amy, you might respond to this, is if we think about Australia's culture of real estate, so whether that's over the last 50 years or even longer, it is not normal for people to live in apartments generally. It's a very low density, spreading further and further out into the peri-urban fringe, eating up farmland. So it sort of that begs the question of is it that lack of appetite? So is it the housing market, the desire for the detached house, which means that apartments or more density in the city by default has to become more of an investment product?
Yeah, so I think, there's a few things that's driving this, and ultimately, at the end of the day, investment in apartments is an economic structure. So if we understand the economics of a building and how that has to form itself, it really, at the end of the day, is also determining the value of those properties. So if someone can't invest in a 3-bedroom apartment within the inner ring of Melbourne and start to have an understanding as to how we can change culturally, if that investment model actually isn't allowing for that to occur because the price of a 3-bedroom apartment might be, close to $1 million, maybe over, then they're forced economically to then go out further into the outer suburbs where there's a house and land package that might work out economically better for them. So culturally, we're ingrained to think that the house is the better investment. That's been the way that it's been, in particularly in Melbourne. However, when we're not introducing a structure that allows that to culturally shift, and it's because we're not providing spaces for families within towers, and we're not providing spaces for families to exist in towers at an economic rate that allows them or attracts them into that model. Okay. And so it's a chicken and egg thing. We're just running around in circles at the moment, and the quickest solution to providing economic housing is to just keep expanding our suburbs. And it's
Jill, on this idea of developing high density housing for people to truly live in, say for family life, and something that can evolve with people. So this is quite common in many countries around the world, predominantly European and Scandinavian countries. As someone who advocates for design quality, what would you want to see in these buildings going forward? So if we moved beyond what we currently have, what would be the embedded qualities of architecturally or otherwise that you'd want to see?
Perhaps to backtrack a bit on the type, I think we do have some amazing examples in Melbourne of more than one family living on a site, and they tend to be pre-war suburbs and there's a lot in St Kilda, Bayside, Elwood, those sorts of areas. There's also a lot in South Yarra. And they were lived in by those who possibly came to Melbourne from Europe and were used to that as a place to live, as a home. I think when the railways were put in and Melbourne spread, and Melbourne, as Michael says, has no topography, so we can just keep going. And Sydney has been stopped by its by its topography. It just can't keep going, whereas Melbourne could keep going till we fill the rest of Victoria, really, if you think about it. But what I have noticed is that we stopped building those, what I would call higher density homes rather than high density. So we went from that penchant for the individual home on a big site. That's what everybody was supported in a way by banks to invest in, and that's what we do. We buy property. And then we leapt, when we went to that kind of housing boom we've had over the last 20 years or so, we leapt into high-rise. And we haven't really embraced that thing in between that was really in existence in Melbourne pre-war, and we haven't done it well. So I think we've got a population that's a little bit terrified of density. They don't quite know what really good density looks like. But we've also got such valuable land that, in a way, really good density doesn't look like those great examples from St Kilda or Elwood anymore, or South Yarra. It actually is double that or triple that, because those properties have gardens, they have outlook, they have ventilation through them, they have sunshine, they have places for the 10 occupants of the site to meet each other. And somehow the value of Melbourne's land has become so high that we don't seem to be able to be achieving those, what I would call amenity on a site. And we're trying to squeeze that amenity into buildings that cover the whole site. And they don't just cover it in a lovely L shape with a courtyard that everyone can share, they cover 100% of the site. And so we can't grow trees, and we can't get decent gardens, and we're kind of too close to our neighbours.
Let's talk about amenity, because it's interesting, because another word for amenity may just be good design.
Agreed.
And it's quite interesting because really you're talking about things like the fact that natural light is actually quite a healthy thing, or air. Strangely enough, air is actually quite important. The idea of not looking out a window at a brick wall. And these are things that BTVV are really drawing attention to in their scheme. But Michael, I ask you a question, because you look at what architects do and say from the outside. How do you think architects have been successful at communicating what the value of amenity? Because actually it needs to sort of have a value beyond an emotional value if it's something that's going to be embedded into a property development. It's got to have a return on investment as well, does it not?
It does, and I sort of...
It's okay, we're all friends here.
I sometimes think architects are their own worst enemies when it comes to talking about what they do and why it matters to the rest of us. I think it's very difficult to show the value of good design, but it's going to have to become crucial if this conversation is going to change. Because it's, in a sense, architecture has possibly, when we're talking about housing, allowed itself to be painted into the corner where the architects are the ones who are allowed to design the colour of the panels on the building, or the types of bench tops, rather than sort of being out there saying, no, why this building is good is because people who are going to live here are going to be healthier because they're only going to have a 10-minute walk to the train station. They don't need to have a car. Or this building, which is full of renters, is a valuable building because the turnover of tenants is so low because everybody likes staying here. So if you as an investor own an apartment in this building, you'll always have a tenant. The value of your asset is going to increase. But that's a very different type of conversation than talking about sort of the aesthetics and how it looks. It's about showing why this is a good building.
So, Amy, would you agree? I mean, you're an architect, you design houses, you've won awards for them. Is there a different language that architects should be using? Maybe I mean, of course, we're all watching renovation shows. We're all watching. It's really a very a significant part of Australia's psyche. How much we think about our homes as part of our identity, but. But do you think in that it does seem to be an inward-looking and an aestheticised and objectified thing?
Yep.
These amenities that you're talking about, these real human values or ecological values, is there a conversation going on in the profession of architecture about how to grapple with this messaging?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing some really good developers, particularly in Melbourne, who and so this comes back to the question, is it the architect or is it actually the client who is driving the brief for the architect, who is governed by an economic model as well? So there's so many things that sort of go into why we have the outcomes that we do. And I think that these developers in Melbourne who are acutely aware of exactly what Michael's highlighting, which is people will want to occupy a building and care for that building if the amenity is right. And so if there is natural ventilation and if there is an ability to build a community within that building, then people will want to stay and people will feel a sense of ownership within that space. And so all those things are actually governed by, and when we talk about amenity, they're governed by how people congregate within buildings. As Jill's saying as well, the role of landscape as well. How do we actually bring landscape into developments rather than it occupying the entire site and there being no ability to breathe? But it's really the client needs to understand, and yes, architects have a role in communicating the value that brings. However, it comes down to the economics of these sites. And so how Jill's sort of talking about recognising that we have incredibly high price, our real estate is incredibly valuable. And so in order to get a significant return on that from an investment point of view, it converts to 100% occupation of a site rather than acknowledging that if we had one less apartment that was dedicated to a courtyard space where people could congregate, which allowed for landscape that the apartments could then look out onto, then that might actually increase the value of that property over time and also allow for longevity within that space. So I think there's a lot of things that are going on within the property market at the moment, but it's also when we talk about models of build to rent effectively is about the idea of the developer or the investor, the client, actually retaining that property, and so that then becomes a sense of ownership as well, rather than the idea of building something and then disappearing,
Well,
selling.
This is an important distinction, isn't it? Because Michael, so the dominant, would it be correct in saying that the dominant developer model for these towers that are going up with smaller apartments, so say one-bedroom apartments predominantly, the model is build it and sell them all quickly?
Yes.
Sell them mostly to investors?
Pretty much.
Pretty much. So so that really there is no incentive for the developer to really have too much quality would possibly be too much risk because of the cost.
They've got no skin in the game. The challenge there is to get the building up as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible, sell the apartments for as much as possible, take the profit and move on to the next one. And you see that with all sorts of issues, like it's happened less over the last year or so, the building construction failures we've seen, the very high profile problems with, say, Opal Tower in Sydney Olympic Park or Mascot Towers. These are buildings that have just been, possibly with all the best will in the world, but put up, and they've been, corners have been cut.
There have been problems.
There have been problems.
Yeah.
But you will also get issues where, for example, a developer or a builder might have the choice to, say, build the shell of a building with a solid concrete structure, which would actually make it thermally more efficient. It'll make it cooler in summer and warmer in winter. But you know what? That's a bit more expensive. You know what? We'll build it thinly. We'll give everybody an air conditioner. Same thing. Now, what that means is the developer actually saves money on the construction, but the people who live in those apartments from here onwards are forever going to be saddled with higher heating and cooling costs.
Indeed, and also there is another cost which is externalised onto the environment. And I mean, and that, I suppose, Jill, if we look at this if we're talking about Victorian government's just introduced a new circular economy policy, certainly we're all driving towards real, the requirement for real change and to engage with climate change in Australia and globally. So, I mean, chucking air conditioning units on everything that is running from electricity, noise, further pollution, etc. What's the role? I mean, so we've talked about the property developer and the architect. What about who else is in this arrangement? Is it planning? Is it government? Who else is in this arrangement which sort of is who are the enablers in the ecosystem at the moment who are enabling this to happen?
I think change takes a long time. You know, it's taken Melbourne a long time to become even an apartment building place, if you like. And I think, if you remember, I think the deputy mayor, a couple of years ago, coined a lot of our development as spreadsheets in the sky, because what has been removed from those spreadsheets is the architecture, because they are our spreadsheets, and we never really know what developers make from these projects. We never get to see those spreadsheets, really. So it's very hard to know when someone confronts you and says, no, that doesn't stack up for me. We don't know what that means. You know, does that mean can you lose one apartment or two apartments or 10? Or where does it sit with that idea of what makes a good community? That great study in Norway that says 40 residences is the maximum that you should have before you lose the sense of community. So those sorts of, that kind of design knowledge that's embedded with architects doesn't actually get to see the light of day, unfortunately, and unless you've got enlightened developers, which we do have some.
Yeah.
And
but what's then, if you're talking about this 40 developments for a sense of community, so we now have quite a few very large buildings in Melbourne and in other cities around which exist now. They've been built. People live in them.
Yep.
What is the emotional or social consequence of this for our cities? Like, what is the cultural consequence of this, in your opinion?
That is such a hard thing to answer, but I think I would almost step outside the building. I think COVID's been a really interesting study of that, because we don't see 40 residences in a building, we see 400. You know, so it's way over what sociologists have said makes a good community. And people are sharing lifts there. They can't get to their own apartments by staircases. There's a whole lot of perhaps challenges have come to light over the past 6 months. I'm really interested to see if that will shift. You know, we have a model in Melbourne which is a podium with a tower on top. In fact, I think you've designed that in this. You've had your architects design that. We've got a kind of a slender tower on the podium of the NGV in this particular exhibition. And I guess my thinking is, though, the podium should be completely accessible without lifts. You know, you should be able to get to every apartment that's in those lower 4 to 6 floors without using a lift. You shouldn't need to kind of cross paths. And so maybe there'll be some change as that comes out of the current constraint that we've seen. I've forgotten the question you asked me.
That's okay. All interesting. And if you're talking about change as well, and COVID, which you mentioned, which of course is the framing context which we are operating in, not only here,
context. That's right.
Elsewhere.
Context.
How else do you think this? Because of course we have a lot of these properties are rented to international students. There's a lot of change in the demographics. Michael, you mentioned in a conversation with me about population growth and that slowing down because of the current situation. So do you think that is that a reset, Amy? Is that a kind of where we actually may? And also there's been an emergence very quickly, Michael, you're keen to say something, I can tell, about a new
calm
focus, a renewed focus on social and affordable housing. So is the kind of this change, this reset with COVID, how it changes the population and demographics of the city, even temporarily?
Yeah. There's a lot going on right now. I mean, obviously, government's just recently announced, the $5.3 billion investment into social housing and affordable housing. So that's been an incredibly important step that's occurred. I mean, Jill, you might correct me, but, I would suggest as a result of, the situation that we've found ourselves in, these things have a life of their own sometimes, but I think, the timing of this is incredibly important. But I think the other thing, when we talk about, what's been fascinating about COVID and being online is that we now all are seeing, we're getting worlds into everyone else's living, how people live. And I think, this thing of students are very reliant upon the university environment in order to have a living room, because their living conditions usually have been compromised by the quality of the space that they're living in. And so the university has had an incredibly important role, and they recognise this, in nurturing students and providing them with really great environments that they can learn in, occupy, socialise, use as their living room, use as their dining room. However, none of that was possible during COVID. And once again, this issue of no air, like how can you be living in a tower with very little amenity, and psychologically that will have had an enormous impact, I think, on society. And so socially, like that, it starts to bring back the questions, what are we doing with these towers? How are we housing people? What are the qualities that we need to be bringing into buildings in order to allow people to live in a very humane way? And I think we've forgotten about that. So I think I don't know if we're going to see a reset, because I think we've been in a position where architecture takes a while to catch up. Things are already in motion, and that's just the nature of building and construction. However, I'm very hopeful that it will influence change in some capacity. I'm just not sure at this point in time to what extent. But I think, building communities is incredibly important. Longevity only occurs if people feel like they want to occupy space. Longevity comes back to sustainability. Sustainability comes back to the quality of buildings. And if we're not building quality into our buildings, and it doesn't have to be gold-plated, does it, Jill? They're quality.
Nope.
So quality built environments will last, and people will adapt to them far more easily than they will if we've got, defects springing up in buildings. These buildings have to last 50 years. We're not sure how
Indeed,
some of them
most
will.
of these buildings are intended to last 50
Yeah.
years. So the recent decade, this sets then the conditions for the future of this city for the next 50 years. Is it possible, architecturally or strategically or with engineering, can we do anything with the buildings that have already been built to make them better? Like if we've created these places and they've been built, and we know there may be problems.
I'm not sure that we can, except I suppose what I would say is there's a layer over the top of the buildings that we've got, which is our streets, our parks, our connections, our networks, and we're lucky enough in Melbourne to have a ground plane that we all occupy. We do a lot of walking in Melbourne, and I don't think I've ever seen our networks used as much as they have been during COVID. And what it has highlighted for me is how important the landscape is, and the sort of, those connecting networks that, we've got a grid city, and it's the difference between Melbourne and Sydney, for example. There's so much kind of ecological and environmentally focused land in Sydney, and they have a network of green spaces that are just sort of a natural consequence of their topography or their environmental condition. We don't really have that entirely. We have, thank goodness, discovered the edge of our river, so at least we occupy the edge of our river. That's one of our natural kind of attributes that we have. But it has highlighted to me how important those, not just those pocket parks that we used to do all the time. Let's just do a park here on this corner. We'll just get rid of a building and put a pocket park in. That's not what we need. We need connected networks of green. Our streets need to be green, and the way we get from A to B needs to be delightful. So I think over the top of our dense city is that natural environment that needs to go with it. So those that do live in a tiny, airless place can get there, and they can walk for 5 kilometres or 10 kilometres and actually get some fresh air and see something delightful. So yes, I don't know that we can backtrack, but what we can do is make sure we don't keep going without thinking carefully about that, what I guess I would call the contextual amenity that you need to provide when people are living so densely.
And Michael, I mean, obviously for any of this to change, we need new business models, we need new financial incentives, or
maybe we need tighter restrictions around political donations.
Possibly we
do.
do.
There's a fascinating story in Today's Age by Royce Miller that I'd encourage everyone to read that makes the point quite eloquently that Victoria has the weakest restrictions on donations by property developers to politicians of any of the eastern states. Now, when Jill talks about the need to do things different, or do we keep going on with what we've been doing, I think there is a lot of responsibility on the people who actually set the rules at a very high level, and those are elected politicians, to ensure that the legal infrastructures, the planning rules, are all actually set with the interests of the whole community in mind, rather than political expediency.
Yeah. And so do you see anywhere in Australia currently where you would say there is an enlightened state or local planning which enforces good design outcomes?
I don't know enough to say that there is. I think this is a work in progress everywhere. The big three eastern states have a degree of rules around political donations. They're all quite easy to circumvent. However, I think we're now coming to a stage in Australia where we've grown up with so much land that we could just bung anything down everywhere, anywhere. Now, we're starting to get to the point, I think, where we're having to think a bit more like the Europeans, or perhaps Asian countries, where space is more constrained, and you don't have the luxury of being lazy with land. You actually have to think very carefully about how it's used. The fast population growth that this country has seen up until probably about 12 months ago has been forcing us, I think, to look at that in a different light. And the pressures that is applying, I think, will start feeding back and creating an impetus on the political system as well to recognise the need to have communities that actually function well and don't increase inequality and just sort of imprison a section of the population in windowless shoeboxes.
And what do you think about these kind of disruptors that are coming into the market, where we look at sort of maybe they're seen as ethical property companies, ones who are looking at developments for long-term rental, or ones where there's sort of covenants over resale? There are models that exist. Does this in any way shift the business model of the really big operators, or is this sort of always going to be sort of boutique fringe activity? Or do you see that sort of changing the tactics of the larger
I think
developers?
We're talking about such a big ecosystem here with housing that there'll be many different styles and many different models. I think we discussed briefly the build-to-rent sector, which is very established in the US. It's very established in Europe, and it's just starting to be done in this country. Mirvac is one of the large developers that is one of the more advanced in this. And I think it ties in with this notion that to have a secure form of housing, you don't actually need to be an owner. And in a country where renters are effectively seen as second-class citizens largely because they have no security of tenure over where they live. If you're a renter, you might only have a rental contract which you can get kicked out with 3 months' notice. That makes it very difficult to not only, on a practical sense, plan your life and make decisions, but it also carries with it a less of a sense of social standing. You know, we attach a lot of importance to owning, the sense of owning a property.
If you rent in a neighbourhood, you're not sort of fully committed to the neighbourhood.
You're not fully there.
Okay.
Now,
right.
if we have a form of commercially managed rental housing that offers renters security of tenure, say 5 or 10 years, it offers them a dignified environment. You know, you're not, you know, you can paint the walls of your house, you can, you can decorate it, you can live in a place that has a sense of community. That will start to show, and it will take a long time to, I think, to gain traction, that you can have a comfortable, dignified living experience without having to own.
Yes.
And
indeed. And Jill, just before we finish up, if we're thinking about the scheme that we started with BTV's interior, do you think that we may even get to a point where developers consider just building the shell, building the main sort of? Why, I'm sort of curious about why they even put in built-in storage and appliances. You know, what is it about that?
They do that because that is actually what people see. People don't see the space and don't see the fact that they haven't got potentially the amenity that they want. The amenity for the buyer is embedded in the appliance.
Okay.
So that seems like a good buy. You know, that's something
Okay.
I want to live with, a lovely sink and a lovely tap or a lovely toilet suite.
So this seems completely superficial, but the fact is that then there's this real disconnect, which is how the language of understanding what amenity is. So that air, we like breathing air, that sunlight is actually quite nice. These other things, how is it that is just not something that people
look for?
know? Well, yes. And
need to
and
be
I mean, I'm not saying that
prompted.
that's the responsibility of architects solely, but surely...
Yeah.
surely
Could I
those
suggest,
are pretty
you
basic...
brought up some of the shows we watch on telly.
Yep.
Could I have so many people say to me, oh, you must love the block. You must love watching the block. And I have to say to them, the block's got to be the worst thing for architecture ever, because people think you can refit your whole house or whatever it is you do in a week. And
when you've got 40 people behind the cameras.
and it's just...
And then you get a celebrity auctioneer to sell it.
Yeah, and you make money on it. And that is just so...
It is all about getting the look, doing it quickly and making money.
It is all about that. And the way our banks support houses as investments is like that too. So we architects, we just bash all the fact that, in fact, architecture is about space.
Okay.
And it's about a place to live that you might love to live and do what you do in your life, and it will allow you to occupy it, work there, love it, love your neighbourhood, love your community, and the sort of the way that our profession, I suppose, or the design profession generally, is undermined by the concept that it's so easy and it's just a bit of a fit out, is a real problem, because it means we can't contribute to our city, which is really important.
And it also talks to the fact that quality is something that can be created really quickly. And we all know in the construction industry, it cannot occur like that. So anything that you see occur over a week is not going to be built to last.
Well, in fact, I know that those images, like we see everybody making, And I know that 40 builders come on site
Yeah.
afterwards, take it down and do it again properly. So at least when it's sold, it is done properly, but it's not done by the people that we're watching.
So it's about slowing down a bit. It's about understanding these fundamental principles more.
Yep.
And it is about getting real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think on this point that Michael's talking to about the fact that we do have these different models that are coming into the way that we understand housing and it as a market is really positive. And I think also the significant issues that we've had within our understanding of the environmental damage that we've been doing, with the fires at the beginning of this year. Obviously, COVID also impacts that. But I think I would suggest that as a society, we have a much greater understanding. It's starting of our responsibility as humans to our environment. And I would suggest that can only be a positive thing in terms of understanding the value that we start placing on what investment is as a concept, what living is as a concept, and how that then starts to impact the built environment. So, and these things take, a really long time. But I think I would suggest that everything has momentum, and it's through many sort of streams that people have attitudes that they're developing through education and understanding that things change, which is,
But then one still has to sell it on an economic argument, because ultimately, if we don't have to pay for electricity, if we don't have to pay for heating, because we live in a place that's got thermal mass, it costs us less to live. And our food is, if our food is grown locally, it's cheaper for us to buy.
Exactly.
All of those sorts of things, they've really got good economic arguments behind them. So that needs to be added to the kind of philosophical position, I think, about sustainability as well.
Okay. There's so much to it, but perhaps it's much more simple than we think.
You got the answer.
Maybe it's right here, right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining this NGV Triennial conversation. It's the opening weekend of the NGV Triennial. We have a series of panels that will run over the next 2 days, here and live online. I'd like to thank Michael Bleeby, Jill Garner, Amy Muir for your great contribution today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.